In this video, I look at the new iRacing UI in Season 4 of 2025 and share my recommended settings for using the Quest 3 with iRacing. And more importantly, show you where all those settings have now been hidden. And all this, of course, from an older gamer's perspective. It feels like only yesterday that I shared my recommended Quest 3 settings for iRacing in 2025, yet here we are again with a completely overhauled menu system courtesy of iRacing. Every tab in iRacing now looks wildly different, and all the settings I previously pointed you towards are hiding in brand new and exciting places to find. So, time to walk you again through exactly where to find those settings and which ones I use to maintain the best FPS when racing with the Quest 3. Towards the end of this video, I'll also cover some ways to claw back performance if your system is struggling on a heavy grid or just struggling in general. There's plenty to go through, so let's get straight to it.
All right, let's get to work.
MetaQuest app and Oculus Debug Tool settings. Before we dive into the iRacing settings and its new layout, let's set a baseline for the settings that I'm going to suggest. My PC runs on an i5-13600K paired with an RTX 4070 Super and 64 gig of DDR4 RAM. I've also got two NVMe drives, one for Windows 11 and a separate one for iRacing. The Quest 3 is connected straight into the motherboard with a fiber 4.5 meter optical cable. And in the Meta app, the connection to my PC tests somewhere between 2.6 and 2.8. With that connection speed, I can run the headset at 90 Hz for a target of 90 FPS in iRacing with the graphics slider at the maximum of 1.5x in the Meta app. If you've got a stronger GPU, you might be able to push this to 120 Hz, but 90 Hz is the sweet spot for my setup. In the Oculus Debug Tool, everything is basically default except the encode bitrate, which I have at 450. You can run this higher if you have a system that can cope with it, and the increase will improve your graphical quality at the cost of performance. But on my system, I get audio glitches and stutters if I push it higher than 450. So this is where I am. I used to have a 0.8 and 0.7 setting in the foveated tangent multiplier area, which is a great way to gain extra performance. But with the native fixed foveated rendering in iRacing, now I find I don't really need this. You can still use these in combination with the fixed foveated rendering in iRacing if you want to, but there is a restriction which I will cover in the performance clawback section later in this video. One quick note on the OpenXR Toolkit overlay, which you can now see. I only use it for this overlay in test footage. Bear in mind though that the readings you see on the overlay are a rough guide. They aren't actual scientific data. But I mostly mention this now because all other settings in the OpenXR Toolkit are disabled. The overlay is the only thing I'm using. If anyone has a suggestion for another better FPS overlay that I can use in VR, please let me know in the comments below. Nothing to do with Steam though, please. I don't use Steam VR. So that's the baseline. Quest 3 connected by cable, Meta app at these settings, and Oculus Debug Tool set like this. With that established, on now to the somewhat confusing scroll fest that is the new iRacing menu.
You have to scroll down?
iRacing display tab settings. Inside iRacing, the menus have been completely redesigned. The only thing that hasn't changed is where you access them from, which is up here at the top of the screen where it's always been. The new system uses tabs across the top, and you can jump to specific sections within these by clicking on the list on the left. Otherwise, you need to scroll, but the choice is yours. The first thing I want to show you here is the display tab. Here I set the resolution to 720. Now, I'll say this only once. This only affects the monitor view, not the resolution in the Quest 3. Lowering this setting to 720, reduces the size of the mirror window on your PC to 720, and helps reduce GPU overhead. If your GPU is driving a 1440 display at full resolution and a VR headset at the same time, it's going to suffer. So keeping this setting particularly low is a free win. Everything else here, I leave out the defaults apart from the brightness and contrast sliders, which I tend to adjust depending on the track and the conditions. Now, scroll all the way to the bottom of the tab where you will find the VR section. Here, VR mode should be set to foveated, not SPS. Last season, this was called MVP, but now it's simply listed as foveated, so don't get confused. It's the same thing with a name change. Once you select foveated, you need to close and relaunch iRacing for this setting to take effect. And from then on, every iRacing session must be launched using the OpenXR option shown here. Nothing else will work. Enabling foveated activates two sliders: percentage resolution to keep and inset size percentage. They're great names, aren't they? In the past, you had to edit an ini file to alter these parameters. So having them here in the menu as sliders is, of course, a welcome change. Just remember, any adjustments you make to these sliders requires a restart of the sim before they take effect. Here's how they work, with a simple graphic that I've created to help you visualize what I'm talking about. I'm showing just one eye in this graphic, but in reality there are two zones per eye, which is why this system is called quad view. So now you know. The resolution to keep slider controls the clarity of everything in your peripheral vision, everything outside the square in the middle. Higher numbers mean a clearer image in this area, but at a bigger performance cost. Lower numbers lighten this GPU load, but make this area look more pixelated. The inset size percentage slider adjusts how large the central sharp zone is, this square here in the middle. Higher values gives you a larger area of clarity in this area, but again demands more from your system. Lower values shrink this area of clarity, making it easier to run on weaker hardware, but reduces the area of central clarity, sometimes quite dramatically. Both sliders range between 25 and 50, with lower numbers for both sliders giving better performance, but with reduced graphical clarity. Higher numbers, of course, do the opposite. On my RTX 4070 Super, the defaults of 35 and 40 respectively work well on all but the most crowded grids, so I use this for the majority of my races. I will circle back to these sliders when I cover performance tweaks for lower tier systems later in this video, but for now, on to the graphics tab.
Move along.
Move along. Move along.
iRacing Graphics tab settings. Next up is the Graphics tab, and in the Well Details section I have almost everything set to low. The only exceptions are cars and event, which I keep on high. But foliage, two-pass trees and quality trees are all switched off. For the cockpit, steering wheel is set to hands and hide obstructions is on halo. That's just a personal preference. I don't think it affects performance. Headlight detail is disabled, as I have found this does chew into performance for very little payoff. When it comes to mirrors, I keep them set to maximum allowed in car, but this varies from car to car. Jump from GT to Formula and you'll need to tweak this setting. Everything below that, including the virtual mirror, is off. I'll circle back to virtual mirror later in this video when I look at clawing back performance. Max cars is set to 63 because RaceLab requires this. I haven't noticed any performance difference when setting this value. For draw cars and draw cars in the pits, I set the first number to control how many cars I see ahead and the second for how many cars appear in the mirrors, as you see here. Reducing these can definitely help weaker systems, but can also increase pop-in, which I have found can be a problem when trying to maintain a steady FPS. However, that being said, it is worth trying to alter this if you are having performance issues. Dynamic level of detail is turned off for a similar reason. On my system, letting iRacing manage a level of detail in VR introduces stutters during pop-in. Impossible to eliminate pop-in entirely, and your results may vary from mine. So if you're struggling to get a stable FPS, try toggling this on. Moving down to image quality. Shader quality is set to high. Ultra is only really for people running something like a 5080 or higher. Particle is low with full resolution toggled off. Shadow maps are on because I like the track to have some basic shadows to make it feel alive, but everything else below is off. Post-processing is also always off on my system. HDR eats into frames for me for no graphical gain, though some drivers say it does help them see brake lights. If you're struggling with brake lights and they just don't stand out for you, give HDR a try. SSR, or space screen reflections, is off. It's a huge performance hog and can clash with iRacing's native foveated rendering. Technically, in the rain, you could miss out on some puddle detail without SSR being on, but rain already hammers the GPU, so unless you've got a monster PC, it's best to leave SSR disabled. For anti-aliasing, I use MSAA at 4x with the filter set to sharp. This means I don't need sharpening on in the post-processing section. Depth of field is off. Finally, the frame section. I run this at no limit since setting a cap can often cause odd behavior in VR on my system. Latency reduction is off. These NVIDIA tweaks have never helped me. Video mem swap and 2004-8 car textures are both on. If you use these settings that I've recommended for the display tab and the graphics tab, but you still can't get a decent and reliable FPS, don't panic. In the next section of this video, I will show you how to claw back some of the GPU power you may need if you are on a lower tier system.
So, you at tier 2 yet?
Clawing back performance. Attempting to claw back performance is where things can get a little bit tricky, especially if your GPU is weaker than a 4070 Super or your CPU is starting to show its age. Bit like me. In a rookie race with a 12-car grid, you're probably going to be fine with the settings I recommend, even on a lower tier system. You should be able to hold a steady frame rate and you should be enjoying your race. However, once you move up to a D-class and beyond with grids of 25 or 30 cars, keeping a stable 90 FPS gets that much harder. The first thing you can try is switching off your mirrors in favor of the virtual mirror. This reduces rendering load a lot, and it also doesn't require a full restart of iRacing to activate it. So you can do it within an iRacing session, but you do need access to the settings menu. If you'd rather keep real mirrors but still need extra headroom, the next thing to adjust are the two sliders in iRacing's VR section, resolution to keep and inset size. Lowering either of these reduces GPU load at the expense of graphical quality. As I mentioned earlier, you need to relaunch iRacing whenever you change either of these sliders. So these adjustments need to be done well in advance of any planned races. Another thing I mentioned earlier is combining iRacing's native fixed foveated rendering with the foveated tangent rendering in the Oculus Debug Tool. You have to be careful though when you're doing this, as my testing shows it's best to only use the horizontal parameter in the Oculus Debug Tool. Adding a value to the vertical multiplier can push the foveated rendering up into your main field of view, which can blur the dash and part of the track and become an absolute immersion killer. So my recommendation is leaving vertical set at 0, but set horizontal to around 0.8 if you do want to use the foveated tangent rendering in the Oculus Debug Tool. This is a safe bet for boosting performance, and it also has minimal effect on visual clarity. Just steer clear of the vertical setting. And finally, Another option to improve FPS is to adjust the resolution slider in the Meta app. Moving it to the left drops the overall render resolution, which does help performance. But personally, I prefer a different approach, and instead of lowering resolution, I like to drop the refresh rate down to 72 Hz if I need that extra performance. Yes, this requires a headset restart, but the payoff in performance is significant. Lowering to 72 Hz gives you a lot more performance headroom, even in busy races, and when combined with a virtual mirror, it's usually enough to give you a stable VR experience on most tracks in most conditions. That's the balancing act with VR. There are plenty of little tweaks and trade-offs, and it can feel like a very long process of testing and retesting to dial everything in correctly. But when you get it right, the payoff is absolutely worth it. VR, when it's dialed in correctly, is the ultimate immersive sim racing experience. At its best, VR makes every lap feel like you are actually in the car and on the track. And in my opinion, that level of immersion is always going to be worth the extra effort.
You lost control.
Conclusions. When I race this season, mostly in the GT4 at the moment, I stick to 90 Hz with the settings I showed throughout this video. On big grids, the start can drop a few frames here and there, but it's never enough to spoil my race, and it usually settles down into a steady 90 FPS after a lap or two. Performance in iRacing does vary a lot from track to track, so keep that in mind if one week everything looks smooth and feels great on your system and the next week everything's in the toilet. The culprit is probably iRacing itself with a newer, poorly optimized track. Either way, you do have options to improve your experience, and you should always experiment to find what works for you personally, and then be prepared to adjust that on a per track basis, week to week. VR is never going to be a set it and forget it deal. If that's what you're after, you'd be better off on a monitor. That being said, if you are still struggling after trying the tips I've shared in this video, please just drop a comment below or jump into the Discord that supports these videos. The link for that will be below. I'm always happy to help, and so are the other members of the Older Gamers Discord group. One last thing before I sign off, virtual desktop. I still haven't bought a Wi-Fi 6E router yet, but once I do, I will make a dedicated video on this software. In the meantime, I hope you found this video helpful, and until the next one, race clean, and I'll see you on track. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button, and if you haven't already done so, subscribe. Click the little bell icon if you want to be notified of any future videos.